Hi friends, it's Kayla. I just wanted to hang out with you today and talk about things. I have not planned this video well. I actually haven't planned this video at all. I am surrounded by books and I want to talk about things that I love in books. And I've wanted to make this video for a long time. I made a video just like this 2+ years ago and I just listed things I love in books, like not genre specific, but themes or ideas or writing things. And that video was so fun because it turned into a spin-off kind of thing where you left so many great recommendations and I'm so grateful for that. And I read so many books because of those comments and made some videos based on the comments from that video. And I've wanted to do a follow-up for a while and I keep thinking about all these things that I like in books. But if I'm being, I don't know, honest, vulnerable for a moment, I'm really struggling with my value as a creator. I feel like a real staple of BookTube is recommending books. And I don't do these types of videos enough because, why? Because sometimes I maybe have realized like I don't have the perfect book recommendation to give, or my reading taste is like more specific, or this just isn't the recommendation video that people want because I have read a certain type of book for a long time and then I start reading a different type of book and maybe that's not what you subscribed. And like, am I talking about the same books too much? Even though I'm reading so many books, I dislike a lot of what I read. And so then like, I feel like I'm talking about the same books a lot. Oh boy, I knew this video was gonna be a mess, but I didn't think it would get this messy this quickly. What I'm really trying to do in my reading life is figure out what I like in books so I can read more of that thing. I think I have said things in my like New Year's resolution videos or goal videos that like I want to read more of this things, for example sci-fi, to figure out what I really like in sci-fi. And I have done those things and I'm reading more of what I like, but along with that comes a lot of experimenting and therefore hating books that I read. And I'm cool with that, but I don't know if it's the most conducive to great content. So I don't really think that you come here for succinct conversations anyway. So those of you who are here are probably down for me just blabbering anyway. I haven't gotten a comment in so long that said like, get to the point, like shut up, like stop this intro and just like get to the list. I think you kind of go elsewhere for that type of content nowadays. And here maybe it's okay that I just like don't really know what I'm gonna talk about. I pulled out a bunch of my favorite books from the last 2 years since I did this video last. And I have been trying to think of like what they have in common and coming to conclusions about the things that I love in books so I can give you more of those things. But in some cases like I'm not gonna have the perfect recommendation, and in some cases like I'm telling you that I think I love this thing and I need recommendations. So I'm actually gonna start with like the perfect example for what I just said, and that is that I think I love forced proximity or like forced closeness books, but I don't want them to be romance. And when you type in like forced proximity books, you get romance because that's what so many people love to read. And I like it because I just think there's this cool idea of like not knowing someone or not thinking that you have anything in common, or like somebody being your enemy, and like you having to acknowledge that this person like could be your friend or could be your partner or just like could be more meaningful in your life than you thought. Books that force characters to reassess their own opinions or biases, maybe, like that's something that I find interesting. So I can think of romance books. This is a YA, I don't know. It's By Your Side by Casey West, where they're like locked in a library together. That's what this one is, right? So like that's cool. And I want more of this, but not romantically. So like that's a reason I thought I would love Survive the Night by Riley Sager. The books that I have found that talk about close proximity stuff that aren't romances, they often tend to be road trip books, and I don't typically love road trip books, but I thought I had a chance with this because it's a thriller, and I didn't like it. But I still like the idea of like getting to know someone in a car and like playing 20 questions and like just learning about somebody. I don't know. Another close proximity one is This Is Where I Leave You by Jonathan Tropper, where it's like a bunch of siblings come together for the first time in many, many years to sit Shiva together. And I reread it recently and didn't like it. So that's where I'm at about a thing that I love. I don't think I have a good example of the thing, but I swear I love it. A couple that maybe could count are The Henna Wars or The Last True Poets of the Sea, though they do involve romance. Part of it is like these characters living in a small town or being in a small school, and they have to work together or work together on a project, or they're just like, they're forced to do the same thing in the same space, and they don't know if they like each other until they're forced to confront their true feelings. I don't know. Can I please find, this is a video where apparently I'm just like begging for your help. This could have been a tweet, but maybe those are good recommendations for people who do like that close proximity thing. Okay, this next one is something that I learned last year about myself and my reading, and I do have examples and I would love more examples. And this one seems like a kind of broad idea, but then it gets kind of specific. So I love books. I love books where we're usually following like a female main character, because the thing that I like has a lot to do with like societal expectations and misogyny, but it's where we have a character who has magical abilities, and throughout the story they become more in control of their magic. Yeah, themes of like autonomy I'm really into. So The Midnight Bargain by C.L. Polk, this would be a good example of this. Also one that came to mind is The Beautiful Ones by Sylvia Moreno Garcia. And then I was also thinking The Year of the Witching by Alexis Henderson. And then another one that came to mind was A Song of Wraiths and Ruin by Roseanne A. Brown. All of these are very different. They're a different like level of fantasy. They have a lot of different conversations, but they all, I think, have this theme of somebody finding themselves with an underlying magical supporting plot line. I used to read a lot more contemporary, and a lot of the contemporary that I liked to pick up was coming of age stories, because just like I like close proximity and getting to know another person, I also like when people just get to know themselves better and feel more like safe in their bodies or in the world. That's probably my like type 8 Enneagram coming through. I just want people to feel safe and supportive and like happy and powerful. And in a lot of these situations, they're living in a society where men have the power, or men control the women's power, or they have to engage in a certain relationship or otherwise dynamic in order for them to fully have the ability to make their own choices. Now where this gets specific and why I prefer seeing this in standalone stories is I don't want it to turn into like an entire shift in the entire world and society. And I understand why people like that. I have nothing against like that concept in general. I think that a lot of YA stories, especially dystopian and fantasy, where that happens, it's important, especially for young women, to feel like they can just like change the world. It's inspiring that you could have this global impact. But I feel like when you enter adult books, there's a bit more of like a realistic empowerment moment where it's more about you and your direct community and the impact that you can have on a small scale. So my worry for the sequels of these is like reading the synopses, it sounds like they are going to go in that like the entire like shift of society because of this one woman. So if you have adult recommendations, especially standalone recommendations that don't go too fantasy, too global impact, this is what I would recommend to you, and I would love to hear anything that you have for me. Next up is kind of in a similar vein, about like taking control of your life. And actually first, I'm going to tell you something that I love in sci-fi, and that is that I've discovered I love clone stories. And I should have already known this because Replica was one of my favorite childhood stories. This book is also called Replica, and I read it years ago and quite enjoyed it. But especially with the discovery of The Echo Wife and the murders of Molly Southbourne, Today Thompson, and Sarah Gailey, I realized that I just love clones. I love the idea of clones. It also comes back to a conversation about autonomy, and what I love as a spin-off of clone stories is when like human creations become overtaken by the humanity that they're not supposed to have. So like you make a clone and you expect it to be this certain thing, and based on all of your scientifical stuff, like it's supposed to do this thing and have this purpose, whether it's the clone or a robot or whatever type of AI, and then by no realistic reasoning it has human traits, and its humanity just like perseveres. I think that might also be a thing that I like about Illuminae, which I'm not going to grab because it's out of my reach, and I'm also going to talk about it in a different example. But I just love the idea of things, again, making decisions for themselves. So if you have any recommendations for this, the shorter the better, and the more metaphorical and softer sci-fi the better, just because that's kind of my taste. Next thing I love, this is one that I was really happy that I came to this conclusion that so many of my favorite books have in common. Even though we're spanning a lot of different genres here with a stack of my favorite books, something that I love to read is a big group of characters and seeing how each individual reacts to the same scenario. So in We Ride Upon Sticks by Quan Berry, there is a group of field hockey players, and they gain this magical ability. There's other things to love in here. They have this collective voice. There's a lot of great conversations, but there's this overall theme of like every single different character that we're in the mind of, we see how they respond to this magic. In the one by John Mars, it has to do with DNA and finding your soulmate. And what I think is cool is that every single person who gets introduced to this idea, they respond to it totally differently, and they want to engage with it completely differently. In Bunny by Mona Awad, one of my all-time favorite books, we have like one main character who we're reading from, but we get to see how she reacts to this ability to create things versus her classmates. And then in Dig by A.S. King, there's just this whole family, and each individual grandchild has a different perspective on their lineage and takes their life in completely different directions based on how they feel about like where they came from. Since I had some good examples for those last ones, I will go into one that I don't have a good example for, but I think I love non-traditional ghost stories. And I don't even know what that means, which is why I don't know how to ask for this recommendation, except that I have Watch Over Me by Nina LaCour, and it's kind of like a metaphorical ghost, or just like the world accepts that there's ghosts. It's kind of hard to explain, and I'm not looking for recommendations like this, but I keep picking up ghost stories, so I'll just show you a couple here that I picked up, and most of them I thought were like fine. And maybe it's the age range that I'm looking at. I don't know what I'm looking for in a ghost story, but it's not the traditional just like, oh, I moved to a new town and my house is haunted kind of thing. I want to read from the perspective of a ghost, or I want to read from the perspective of a ghost, but you don't know that you're reading from the perspective of a ghost. I like paranormal stories, but I will admit most of the ones that are on my radar that I've heard of, that I've read, have been YA, and maybe I just like don't really know where to go to get into adult ghost stories. I don't necessarily want, I'm thinking about so many movies where just like a family moves into a house and there's like all this domestic drama. I want something unique, but I don't know what I'm looking for, and therefore I don't know how to find it. But maybe you'll know because you know me. Actually, maybe my next one will kind of explain this better. Or maybe this is what I'm looking for. I don't know. I love nature witchcraft. Like, I want to call it elemental magic, but I don't think that explains what I'm saying or what I'm trying to say. But I love fantasy books that have to do with specifically like the ground. Not water, air, fire, and earth. Only earth. A great recommendation for you would be Burn Our Bodies Down by Rory Power if you're looking for something. I wish I loved that. That felt like everything that I like should have loved. But an example I do have is Wild Beauty by A.M. Macklemore. This has to do with like flowers coming out of your body. And The Trees Crept In by Don Cardigick. This is like nature because the forest is moving closer to a house. In Sawkill Girls, the island has like a narration of its own and a part to play in the story. And then in Follow Me to Ground, the ground does some magical healing things. So like they're not witch stories, they're not magic stories, but they do possibly involve witches and magic, and just like where the earth and nature has an impact. Not so much like a witch is going out and like collecting leaves and things and doing things with it, but there is a nature aspect to the magic or the weirdness. That was not a great explanation, but if you have recommendations for that, that'd be sweet. I have a book, actually I have a couple books on my TBR shelf. The Nature of Witches, and there's one other one, something about wildness, that I think fits what I'm looking for. But again, if you have adult recommendations, especially that are standalones, what happens is when I think about magic books and witchy books that I want to read, a lot of times my mind goes to teen books, because I think I also associate adult titles with like epic fantasy, high fantasy, and series, when I'm sure that's not true, but those are just the things that tend to be on my radar. So I need to find more magic in the adult genre, but that also isn't like romance centric. This is why I make videos called overly specific book recommendations, because like I'm very specific about what I want. I just don't think that I know where to find it. You know what I do know how to find? Portal fantasy. I have realized my love of portal fantasy in the last couple of years. In my last video where I talked about things I love, I talked about books that play with time, and this could also fit into this. I also talked about books that have like weird unexplained magic, which could also fit into this. So The Midnight Library by Matt Haig is something that I love. This has to do with this woman who goes into this library and basically gets to live all of these different lives that she could have had. In The Hollow Places by T. Kingfisher, it follows a woman and this other guy, and they enter this mysterious hole and they land in this like extravagant, strange world. And then of course one of my favorite series is Every Heart a Doorway, and this also fits with the thing about different characters experiencing a similar thing but seeing how everyone reacts to it differently. This is a series by Shauna McGuire, and it has to do with children who open doors to like the world that they're supposed to live in, and every character is like kind of in a different book, and we get to visit their world and see how they grapple with that experience. I just like the idea of a character going somewhere unexpected, and like it's a little bit magical, but it could also not be very magical, but the portal to get there is the magic portion of the story. Next up, I've learned that I love books that talk about other books, and with that said, there are like two books that come to mind right away that you'll be like, no you don't, because you didn't like The Starlessy or The Book Thief. And these are like fan favorites, like cult classic books. So don't make me explain that because I can't. But I just like books that have an academic setting. I think this is why I often like academic settings, is because we're following characters who talk about other books. And I just love getting to see books mentioned in books, and I love characters who are reading and talking about books. So that's why, like, I love The Secret History and I love If We Were Villains, I think, and why recently I enjoyed, or at least picked up, A Lesson in Vengeance. My review is coming for this soon, by Victoria Lee. It was just so fun seeing all of like my favorite books pop into like casual conversations. Like, they were just talking about We've Always Lived in the Castle and The Secret History, and like books I haven't read like Rebecca. I just love following academics, I guess. But then also in a setting like 8 Perfect Murders, where there's a character who's committing murders based on books, the classic murders inside those classic books. I just really like that. I like characters who run bookstores or are librarians or who have a passion for books, and then the book part drives the narrative itself. I feel like this is kind of a basic one, and it's like, doesn't every reader like to read about books? But a lot of times when I talk about this thing, or I look up like book lists about this thing, I don't really find what I'm looking for, because I don't just want contemporary romance. It's like 2 authors who are in love, or this character runs a bookstore and they meet an avid reader. Like, that's not what I'm looking for. And I definitely need to find more of those things, and more of those things that don't have stories within stories. Because a lot of times I will pick up a book that's about books and the love of reading, and then there will be stories inserted in it, which isn't my favorite thing. Next up is mixed media. I don't think this needs any explanation at all. Books like Illuminae, where the entire thing is like documents. Obviously House of Leaves is one of my favorite things, and this is like stories within stories, like commentary on different things, and it's like a whole document in and of itself. Another example though, if you're looking for like a YA recommendation, I love Watch Us Rise by Ellen Hagen and Renee Watson. It is a traditional narrative, but then there's also like blog posts and poetry and a lot of other things to read and look at. And then also The Only Black Girls in Town by Brandy Colbert I really enjoyed, because again, it's a traditional story, but then there are letters in here that these 2 girls find, and that's a whole portion of the story, is finding out like where these letters came from and who wrote them and how they're gonna have an impact on like the girls and the story that they're telling too. And then lastly is just like books that have a not linear writing style or timeline, and I'm sure a lot of the books I've already mentioned do that, but I just want to take a specific moment to talk about some of my favorite books, because something that I recognize is a lot of my favorite books do this. So like in Middle Game by Seanan McGuire, there's twins and there's like a lot of science and there's like this mind communication thing, but also it's told in like a strange timeline. I also really like heavy metaphor, which is something that exists in a lot of these that I mentioned in my earlier video. Kind of. I just talked about how I love fabulism and magical realism and light fantasy, and was trying to describe it like that, but I could also describe it with these books that I've read since then by explaining it with heavy metaphor writing. I love books where you're just like, is this actually happening? Like, is what this author is saying actually what's happening, or is it a metaphor? Is it really fantasy? So like The Wicker King by Kay Ingram and Catherine House by Elizabeth Thomas. Books that have a lot of negative reviews sometimes, because people say like, this made no sense and I don't understand what was going on, and like how I don't like how there's an ending that can be interpreted however you want. But that's something that I love. Mrs. Death by Selena Godin has an unconventional timeline and writing style. This Is How You Lose the Time War by Max Gladstone and Amal El-Motar. The timeline of this is a little bit like messy, and I just love books that play with time and have heavy metaphor. Black Girl Unlimited by Echo Brown. I know I've talked about so many of these books in so many different capacities, but I like being able to categorize them into like the reasons that I think I loved them so much. Monkey Beach by Eden Robinson is a good example of this one too, actually. I like little moments, like vignettes of somebody's life, little stories, and they can be out of order and they can be metaphorical, and I think that's a good way to categorize something that I love. So that's it. That's today's video. Some recommendations, some asks for recommendations, categorizing of books, organizing my mind. Definitely let me know if you want another series of me reading your recommendations. And I hope you know that I appreciate every single one of the comments that comes in, thinking about what I might like. So thank you very much for watching, and I will see you later. Bye!